In the winter of 1945, a Soviet transport vessel departed from Kronstadt Naval Base, carrying what official records described as standard military cargo, 3 T-34 tanks bound for the Baltic offensive. For 80 years, military historians assumed this vessel was just another casualty of German U-boat activity, one of thousands lost in the final months of the Second World War. But when an underwater ROV descended to the wreck site in October 2025, its cameras revealed something that made the dive team immediately contact Moscow. What they found sealed inside those tank compartments wasn't standard military equipment. It was evidence of an experimental program, so classified that its existence had been erased from every official record. The vessel carried a crew of 37 men, none of whom appear in Soviet naval casualty lists. Their families received no death certificates, no acknowledgement, no closure, just decades of silence enforced by Stalin's NKVD. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of experimental weapons programs conducted with zero oversight and complete disregard for human life. The newly revealed evidence suggests that dozens of similar vessels may have transported classified cargo across the Baltic, Black Sea, and Arctic waters during the final year of the war. For 8 decades, the true scope of Soviet experimental weapons development remained hidden, protected not by classification laws, but by the deliberate destruction of records and the silencing of witnesses. The vessel's location made no tactical sense. It was found 73 meters below the surface, 15 kilometers off course from any known convoy route in waters that Soviet naval charts from 1945 marked as restricted zones. Why would a standard transport deviate so drastically from established safe passages? The discovery came through the Baltic Sea Wreck Survey using a Saab CI Falcon ROV equipped with high-resolution 3D multi-beam sonar and 4K imaging systems. The technology can create millimeter-accurate renderings of wreckage at depths where human divers cannot safely operate. The ROV's initial scan revealed a vessel approximately 60 meters in length, with an unusually reinforced cargo hold, steel plating twice the thickness of standard Soviet transport ships. The hull bore no identifying marks, no registry numbers, no naval insignia. More disturbing, the cargo bay doors had been welded shut from the outside, with reinforcement beams that could only have been installed before departure. Standard military transports were never modified this way. The reinforced hold and welded doors suggested the cargo was either extremely dangerous, extremely valuable, or both. The off-course location indicated either an attempt to avoid detection or a catastrophic navigational failure. Either way, this vessel was not conducting routine military operations. The survey team's lead archaeologist would later describe the moment as realizing we were looking at something that was never supposed to be found. When the ROV's manipulator arms finally cut through the corroded welds, the camera revealed what Soviet authorities had tried to bury forever. 3 tanks sat secured in the cargo hold, but they bore only superficial resemblance to standard T-34 models. The dimensions were wrong. The turret configurations didn't match production specifications. Using laser measurement systems and spectral analysis, the team could examine the tanks without disturbing the wreck site. Metallurgical scanning revealed alloy compositions that didn't match any known Soviet production specifications from 1945. Here's where the story takes a turn. The first tank featured a turret mounting for a 122mm gun, a caliber that wouldn't appear in Soviet service until 1947 with the IS-3 heavy tank. The second tank had been gutted entirely, its interior converted into what appeared to be a sealed laboratory with lead-lined containers still intact. The third tank showed modifications that military engineers couldn't immediately explain. An internal compartment separated from the main hull by rubber gaskets and airtight seals, ventilation systems that pumped air outward, never inward, a dispensing mechanism connected to pressurized tanks mounted where ammunition would normally be stored. And get this, these weren't production vehicles, but experimental platforms. The lead-lined containers suggested radioactive materials or chemical weapons. Soviet archives declassified in the 1990s hinted at experimental weapons programs, but Western historians dismissed most accounts as Cold War propaganda. The physical evidence proved those dismissed accounts were real. What makes this particularly chilling is the realization that these experimental systems were being transported by sea because they were too dangerous or too classified to move overland. The crew may never have been told what they were carrying. ROV cameras penetrated the crew quarters and found something that transformed this from a historical curiosity into a crime scene. The remains of the crew were still at their stations. The navigator sat at his charts. The radio operator's hand rested near his telegraph key. Forensic imaging and 3D reconstruction allowed investigators to examine the scene without disturbing what is legally a war grave. The crew had not died from torpedo impact, fire, or drowning. There were no blast damage patterns, no evidence of hull breach at crew level, no signs of panic or evacuation attempts. The bodies were positioned as though the men had simply stopped functioning, mid-task, mid-movement, with no defensive wounds or trauma visible on the skeletal remains. And get this, toxicology analysis of sediment samples around the remains showed traces of chemical compounds that shouldn't exist in a maritime environment. Organophosphate derivatives, chlorinated agents, compounds that matched chemical weapons the Soviets would later develop in the 1950s and 60s. The crew compartment seals had failed, but not from external pressure or torpedo damage. They had failed from the inside. The sealed experimental cargo had leaked. The most horrifying part is that Soviet naval records show this vessel was reported missing on February 18, 1945. But the crew's personal effects, watches, chronometers, log entries, indicate they survived until at least February 21st. For 3 days, these men drifted in a sealed vessel, slowly dying from exposure to their own cargo, while Soviet Naval Command made no rescue attempt. The captain's final log entry reads, "Crew experiencing respiratory distress. All compartment seals compromised. Request immediate evacuation." There is no record of any response, but here's where it gets complicated. Why did Soviet authorities erase every trace of this vessel and its crew from official records? Archival researchers cross-referenced the wreck's location with declassified German naval records, Soviet naval logs, and testimony from Baltic fishermen collected in the 1990s. German U-boat logs from February 1945 show no attacks in this sector. Soviet convoy records list no vessels lost on these dates. The official narrative simply erased this ship from existence, but fishermen's accounts from the 1950s describe a Soviet salvage operation in this exact area using equipment far more sophisticated than standard recovery gear. They reported seeing ships with no identifying marks conducting operations under armed guard, warning fishing vessels to stay away under threat of being fired upon. Bottom line, Soviet authorities knew exactly where this vessel was. They attempted salvage but abandoned the effort, likely after determining the cargo was too contaminated or too compromised to recover safely. Rather than acknowledge the disaster, they chose to bury it. They erased crew records, destroyed documentation, and reclassified the entire program. The real kicker is that families of the crew spent decades searching for answers. Some were interrogated by the NKVD for asking too many questions. Others were told their loved ones had deserted or been executed for cowardice. The truth that they died carrying out classified orders remained hidden for 80 years. In November 2025, the research team made one final dive to document the forward cargo hold. What they found there ties together every disturbing element of this investigation. Sealed in waterproof containers welded to the interior bulkhead were orders, technical specifications, and transport manifests. The documents confirm that this vessel was part of Operation Typhoon Shield, a classified program to develop and test chemical and radiological weapons for potential use against German forces during the final offensive. The experimental cargo included prototype tanks, modified to deploy these weapons, along with containers of the agents themselves. The story we've been telling for 80 years about Soviet military operations in 1945 was incomplete. This wasn't about defeating Germany. It was about developing weapons that pushed far beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare. The Soviet Union was prepared to deploy chemical and radiological weapons on the Eastern Front if the German resistance proved too costly to overcome through conventional means. This was not fate. This was not inevitable. This discovery reveals that the Soviet Union was further along in experimental weapons development than Western intelligence ever suspected. It confirms that Stalin's regime prioritized weapons advancement over crew safety and was willing to erase entire crews from history to protect program secrecy. The wreck site has been declared a protected war grave, but the questions it raises remain unanswered. How many other vessels carried similar cargo? What happened to the other crews? Were any of these weapons actually deployed? The families of the 37 crew members now have confirmation of what happened, but the Russian government has yet to acknowledge the program or issue any official statement. What else is out there, hidden not by the ocean's depth, but by 8 decades of deliberate silence and destroyed records? If this investigation left you questioning what other secrets remain buried beneath the waves, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what maritime mystery I should investigate next.